Welcome to the unknown zone, where we reveal the hidden moments that changed history forever. Today, we uncover the day Adolf Hitler discovered that the spies he trusted had betrayed him, and how that realization destroyed the Nazi war strategy in a single morning. There are events in history that don't just shape battles, they break illusions. The 6th of June, 1944 was one of those days. While Allied soldiers crossed the cold waters of the English Channel toward Normandy, Hitler slept far away from the front lines, confident that the invasion he feared most would happen at Pas-de-Calais. It wasn't confidence built on intuition. It was confidence built on information, intelligence reports, arriving for months from inside Britain. Reports he trusted, reports he believed. Those reports were lies. Every spy the Nazis relied on, men they believed were risking everything to serve the Reich, had already been captured or turned by British intelligence. Under British control, these double agents fed Hitler exactly the information the Allies wanted him to believe. They described armies that didn't exist. They reported troop movements that were never real. They reinforced the idea that Normandy, where the Allies truly planned to invade, was nothing more than a distraction, and Hitler believed them completely. Operation Fortitude, the Allied deception plan, was one of the most successful in human history. It manipulated maps, reshaped German strategy, and blinded the Nazi high command at the most critical moment of the war. But everything collapsed when the first real invasion reports arrived. By dawn on D-Day, when German commanders confirmed that tens of thousands of Allied troops were storming the Normandy beaches, a cold truth hit the Nazi leadership. The spies they trusted had fed them lies. Their entire defense plan was built on falsehoods, and Hitler's confidence, once absolute, began to crack. This is the story of how that deception was created, how Hitler was manipulated into believing it, and how the truth destroyed the German war plan in a single day. To understand how Hitler was fooled so completely, you have to understand the scale of the deception built around him. Operation Fortitude wasn't just a plan. It was an entire world crafted to mislead the most dangerous military mind in Europe. It began with a simple question the Allies asked themselves: what does Hitler already believe? Because deception doesn't work by creating new ideas. It works by strengthening the ideas the enemy already trusts. Hitler believed the invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais. It was the closest point to Britain. It offered the fastest route across the Channel. And for years, German intelligence had warned him it was the logical landing zone. So the Allies used that belief as the foundation of the lie. They created the first United States Army Group, a completely fake army positioned in southeast England, precisely where a real invasion force would gather if Calais were the target. It had fake tanks made of rubber, fake aircraft made of wood, fake camps laid out in patterns designed to be spotted by German reconnaissance planes, and perhaps most importantly, fake radio traffic, thousands of messages sent by thousands of imaginary soldiers. But physical deception wasn't enough. The Allies needed something Hitler trusted more than anything else: human intelligence. This is where the turned German spies became the heart of the operation. One by one, Britain captured or intercepted nearly every German agent operating on British soil. Instead of executing them, British intelligence offered a different choice: work for Britain instead. Most accepted. Some were threatened. Some were tricked into believing the Nazis had abandoned them. And some were simply persuaded that the war was already lost. These double agents fed Berlin a steady stream of carefully crafted lies, mixed with just enough truth to feel real. Their handlers at MI5 and MI6 knew exactly how German intelligence evaluated information. They knew the language these spies used, their habits, their personalities, their history. They studied them, lived inside their identities, and made sure every report felt authentic, and Berlin believed every word. One spy in particular, known as Garbo, became the most trusted agent in Hitler's entire global network. Hitler believed Garbo had built an empire of sub-agents across Britain. In truth, those sub-agents never existed. They were fictional identities invented on paper. Yet, Hitler trusted Garbo so deeply that he was awarded the Iron Cross based entirely on information the Allies themselves had written. That information told Hitler exactly what he most wanted to hear. The real invasion will come at Pas-de-Calais. Normandy landings will be a diversion. Keep your powerful panzer divisions away from Normandy. Hold your reserves for the Calais attack. This became the cornerstone of Hitler's strategy. The Allies weren't just feeding him misinformation. They were controlling his mindset, shaping his expectations, guiding his decisions, training him to believe one thing so strongly that when the real invasion began, he dismissed it as impossible. By late May 1944, Hitler was completely certain the Allies would strike Calais. His generals were certain. The entire German military alignment was certain. And that certainty would soon become one of the greatest military catastrophes in German history. In the early hours of the 6th of June, 1944, while storm clouds hung over the English Channel, the deception that had held strong for months began to crack. But the truth didn't hit Berlin all at once. It arrived in fragments confusing, unclear, and unbelievable. At 0:15, German radar stations detected unusual activity across the Channel. Moments later, a flood of reports began arriving. Airborne troops dropping inland, ships gathering at sea, artillery fire in the distance. But instead of triggering alarms, these reports triggered doubt. For months, Hitler's intelligence network had convinced him Normandy was nothing but a distraction. And because deception had shaped his expectations so completely, the first real warnings of the invasion sounded like more noise, more diversion, more shadow play. The German commanders at the front felt the urgency immediately. They saw enemy paratroopers landing behind their lines. They saw naval bombardments lighting up the coast. They heard the roar of thousands of Allied aircraft overhead. But the one man who needed to understand the truth was sleeping. Hitler was at the Berghof, his mountain retreat in Bavaria. When his officers tried to wake him, they hesitated, not because they didn't understand the threat, but because they feared his reaction. No one wanted to be the person who told Adolf Hitler that everything he believed was wrong. So, for hours, the German military fought blind, without the approval needed to activate armored divisions, without permission to deploy reserves, without the authority to react with the force required to stop the invasion. By 4 a.m., panic was spreading across German command posts in France. Reports grew more alarming. Thousands of landing craft moving toward the beaches, destroyers firing on coastal defenses, Allied aircraft striking roads and communication lines. For frontline officers, the truth was clear. For Berlin, it was still unthinkable. At 6:30 a.m., as the first American soldiers of the 1st Infantry Division stepped onto Omaha Beach, the German 7th Army sent a desperate message to headquarters. Enemy assault is in progress. The message reached Hitler's staff. They reviewed it, they argued over it, and they reached the same conclusion. This was not the real invasion. This was the lie on which the lie depended. A fake invasion to distract from the true landing at Pas-de-Calais. And because of the months-long deception, because of the carefully crafted illusion, because Hitler had been trained to expect only Calais, the real invasion was treated as a trick. Inside those tense walls, no one wanted to believe the truth. No one dared contradict the mindset Hitler had embraced for so long. No one could imagine that the intelligence reports he relied on, the reports he personally praised, were built on betrayal. So, when the news finally reached him, hours after the first landings began, his reaction wasn't shock. It was denial. He insisted that Normandy was not the main attack. He insisted the Allies were trying to draw his forces away from Calais. He insisted his spies were still right, that the real invasion was coming later. Even while thousands of Allied troops fought their way up the beaches, Hitler remained trapped inside the illusion the Allies had crafted for him. But with each passing hour, the truth became harder to ignore. More landings, stronger resistance, massive Allied air dominance, German divisions overwhelmed and outnumbered. The illusion had begun to collapse. The war had shifted, and Hitler was about to face the reality he had avoided for months. By late morning on June 6, the illusion that had protected Hitler's confidence for months was dying, piece by piece. Reports from Normandy were no longer scattered or uncertain. They were overwhelming, consistent, and impossible to dismiss. Yet inside the German High Command, disbelief still clung like a shadow. Around 10 a.m., detailed updates began arriving from the 352nd Infantry Division on Omaha and the 716th Division near Sword and Juno. These units weren't sending vague warnings anymore. They were sending desperate ones. They reported massive naval bombardments destroying coastal defenses. They reported Allied tanks rolling across the sand. They reported positions collapsing faster than reinforcements could move. They reported chaos. This was not the behavior of a diversionary attack. This was the arrival of an invasion force determined to break through and not turn back. But Hitler's staff still hesitated. They still clung to the belief that Calais was the true target. They still believed the double agents. They still believed their own illusions. At 11 a.m., Field Marshal Rundstedt, the commander of all German forces in the West, made a desperate call to Berlin. His message was direct, urgent, and honest. The invasion is here. Normandy is the main landing. We must deploy the panzer reserves immediately. His voice carried frustration, fear, and the weight of a man watching the front collapse in real time. Yet even then, German High Command hesitated, waiting for Hitler. When they finally reached him, Hitler listened quietly. The room around him was tense and silent. Officers watched his face, searching for the first hint of understanding. Instead, he asked a single question. Where is the attack on Calais? That question revealed everything. Even as the truth stood in front of him, bleeding through every report, Hitler's mind remained chained to the lies he had been fed for months. It took more time, more reports, more failures, more warnings, before the reality finally broke through his denial. The message that forced the truth on him came shortly after noon, when German commanders sent a direct assessment from France. Enemy forces in Normandy growing rapidly. Beaches secured. Reinforcements landing without interruption. We cannot dislodge them. There was no way to interpret that as a diversion. No way to delay decisions. No way to deny the truth. Normandy was the real invasion. And in that moment, something shifted inside Hitler. Witnesses later described him as falling into a cold, heavy silence. He stared ahead without speaking, absorbing the fact that everything he had believed, everything his spies had told him, was wrong. For months, he had trusted intelligence reports that were supposed to be the eyes of the Reich. Now he realized those eyes had been blind, or worse, deceived. The weight of this realization was enormous. Entire divisions had been positioned incorrectly. Critical armored units had been held back. The Atlantic wall defenses had been stretched thin. And the one opportunity Germany had to crush the invasion at the beaches was slipping away by the minute. Slowly, painfully, Hitler understood the truth. The British had fooled him. His spies had betrayed him. And the turning point of the war was unfolding exactly where he least expected it. The consequences of this moment would shape the entire future of the conflict. Because once Hitler understood the truth, his response came too late. When the truth finally reached Hitler that Normandy was the real invasion, German command shifted instantly from denial to chaos. What followed was not a coordinated military response, but a desperate scramble filled with panic, conflicting orders, and internal blame that tore through the leadership like a storm. By early afternoon on June 6, Hitler's generals were already arguing among themselves about who was responsible for the disaster unfolding on the French coast. Some blamed the Luftwaffe for failing to control the air. Some blamed the Navy for not stopping the Allied ships. And some, quietly, fearfully, began blaming the very intelligence network Hitler had trusted more than all of them. Inside Hitler's headquarters, the atmosphere grew bleak. Maps were spread across tables. Pins were moved. Reports came in faster than they could be read. Yet every update carried the same message. The Allies were entrenched. The beaches were lost. And the window to stop the invasion was closing. Hitler finally ordered the deployment of the 12th SS Panzer Division and the Panzer Division. These armored units were among Germany's strongest, trained and waiting for a moment like this. But they had been held far from Normandy not because commanders wanted it that way, but because Hitler believed Calais needed protection more urgently. That decision, guided by the lies fed to him over months, would now cost Germany everything. When the panzers finally moved, they moved too late. Allied aircraft swarmed the roads, bombing convoys, destroying fuel trucks, and smashing bridges. German tanks crawled forward under skies the Allies completely controlled. The Wehrmacht had the power to deliver a devastating counterattack, but they never reached the beaches in time. Meanwhile, on the front lines, German soldiers were being overwhelmed. At Omaha Beach, despite fierce resistance, the Americans had secured footholds. At Gold, Juno, and Sword, British and Canadian units had broken through the first defensive lines. At Utah, The landings went almost flawlessly. Every minute, the Germans failed to act decisively. The Allies gained strength, hundreds of ships, thousands of troops, endless supplies. Hitler's staff watched the reports pile up. Their confidence was gone. Their arguments turned into whispers. Behind closed doors, some began saying what no one dared speak aloud. Our intelligence was wrong. The Führer of us deceived. The invasion is unstoppable now. But the most painful truth, the one no officer dared present directly to Hitler, was that the deception had worked because he believed exactly what he wanted to believe. He had trusted reports that flattered his assumptions. He had ignored voices that challenged them. He had built his strategy on illusions, not reality. And now the cost of those illusions was spilling across the beaches of Normandy. By the evening of June 6, Hitler finally faced the full magnitude of the deception. Garbo, the double agent he had honored, had lied to him. The fake armies he feared never existed. The invasion he dismissed as a diversion had broken through the Atlantic Wall. Realization turned to rage. Rage turned to suspicion. Suspicion turned inward, poisoning the German command with fear and blame. But the truth was simple. Hitler had been outsmarted. The Allies had controlled his expectations. Operation Fortitude had shattered the German war plan before the first Allied soldier even touched French soil. And the day he realized it was the day he understood the war was slipping out of his hands. By the night of the 6th of June, 1944, the beaches of Normandy were firmly in Allied hands. The deception was complete, the illusion shattered, and Hitler stood face to face with the consequences of trusting a world built on lies. But the real impact of that day did not end on the beaches. It continued in the days and weeks that followed, reshaping the entire German war effort from the inside. Hitler had always relied heavily on intelligence. He believed he understood his enemies better than they understood him. He believed he could predict their intentions, outmaneuver their strategies, and stay one step ahead. But after D-Day, that confidence, once absolute, evaporated. Reports that once gave him certainty now filled him with suspicion. Spies he once praised now seemed unreliable. Even his trusted generals sensed a new tension in the air, a fear that every plan, every assumption, every belief might have been built on misinformation. The double agents, especially Garbo, had done more than deceive him about Calais. They had destroyed his ability to trust what he saw. Inside the command rooms, a quiet collapse began. Hitler demanded explanations. He wanted to know how the Allies had built such a massive invasion force unseen. He wanted to know how the Atlantic Wall had been penetrated so easily. He wanted to know why no one had convinced him Normandy was a real threat. No one dared tell him the truth. He had refused to listen. His own certainty had become a prison. German strategy in France fell apart almost immediately. Panzers redirected too late. Infantry units overwhelmed. Supplies cut off. Communication lines destroyed by Allied air power. Every attempt to launch a counterattack came at a cost. Every hour, the Allies grew stronger. Every mile they pushed inland revealed the scale of the failure. The German generals knew the truth. Normandy was not just a military defeat, it was a psychological one. The Reich had been blinded, manipulated, and forced into making decisions that benefited the enemy at every turn. And it all began with the moment Hitler realized his spies had lied. That realization broke something inside him. He became more erratic, more paranoid, more isolated. He no longer trusted the voices around him, not even the ones trying to save what remained of the German defense. Meanwhile, the Allies pushed forward relentlessly. Cherbourg, Caen, Saint-Lô, every victory built on the cracks created by Operation Fortitude. Every triumph made possible because Germany had been preparing for an invasion that never came. History often marks D-Day as the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. But the true turning point, the moment the war truly shifted, was the instant Hitler understood he had been deceived. The moment he realized that the intelligence he trusted most had been controlled by the enemy. The moment he finally understood that the war he thought he could predict was already slipping beyond his reach. That day, Germany didn't just lose territory. It lost the strategic advantage it had depended on for years. It lost faith in its own judgment, and it lost a leader who could differentiate reality from illusion. The Allies had accomplished something far greater than a landing on the beaches. They had broken the mind of the man leading the German war machine, and history would never be the same.